Well, I have a couple of guests in studio. I have Trevor Rubenstein, who's Director of Good News for Israel in the Twin Cities. That's the oldest Jewish evangelism agency in America. Welcome, Trevor, for the first time.
Thank you, Jan.
I have Pastor Greg Stone from the Jesus Assembly in St. Peter, Minnesota, an Assemblies of God church. And Pastor Greg, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
My producer, Larry Kutzler, will be joining into this discussion as well. And 3 out of the 4 of us do have a Jewish background, so we have sort of built-in interest in all of this topic. I don't know where to begin, gentlemen. We're going to move quickly. Tell me, Trevor, how is the Messianic movement and Hebrew roots movement different, or are they different?
Yes, and they can be tied in, they can be different. Really quickly, Messianic movement really was a movement that developed out of trying to have a Jewish way of worship and a Jewish type of service for Jewish people who came to faith.
Nothing wrong with that.
Correct. And then what developed out of that was also a Hebrew roots movement, which really was focused more on the Hebrew roots, understanding more of a Acts type of church and how things were occurring in the book of Acts, more in more of a Jewish mindset, more so than what developed later after there was a lot of changing in the church as it spread throughout many Gentile nations.
A lot of Gentiles involved in the movement, particularly of Hebrew roots, and we can get a better definition of that in just a moment. But why is that? Why was the traditional church, and Pastor Greg Stone, you are a pastor, why do you think the traditional church wasn't sufficient for some of these folks who go into the Gentiles, who go into either Messianic or Hebrew roots? What happened in the church?
I think that there's a hunger in the church for people to understand their roots. I think it's very connected to what's going on in America. America seems to have lost a sense of what its roots were. There's the whole debate about the importance of the Constitution, and are we still living that way or not? That whole debate. And so I think there's a similar kind of debate going on in the church with regard to our roots.
Part of the rise of these movements is due to the fact that the church, as I said in my intro here, the church has moved further and further away from all things Jewish. And Greg, as you and I talked on the phone the other day, you acknowledged that heavily, and being a pastor and all, the church has moved away from this. And what has come along to solve the dilemma of not focusing on anything Israel or Jewish is not necessarily healthy, because I got to say, as I said in my intro, one of the greatest emails and calls I get most frequent from people who have loved ones in their life who are suddenly approaching them and saying, why don't you, fill in the blank? Why don't you worship on Saturday? Why are you not observing the feast days? On and on and on. Why this, why that? And folks don't really have an answer for this because they're just plain puzzled and confused. I want to ask you about, and by the way, what they're troubled about is they see these folks heavily lifting up the law, as I said in my intro, more than grace. And your average Christian, Trevor, your average Christian cannot accept that, and I'm not sure they should accept it.
I think that what we saw in part was a counter pendulum, right? So when we move too far away from something, the counter reaction is to move often too far in the opposite direction. So as the church had moved away from, the Ten Commandments, even as Ray was talking about earlier in your show, Jan, and focus more on grace and more on these type of things, away from anything that would have been Jewish, the counter reaction can be a hyper focus on those things. And the problem with that, Jan, is often it can take away the focus from Jesus.
And that's what those who are being approached, why don't you do this and this and this and this? And that's what they tell me. What happened to the focus on Jesus?